Get started close to being on time and let them join us as they arrive in here as well. Well, welcome to the Manning Center. If you have been here before, welcome back. If you haven't been, thank you for joining us today. Actually, I do see a lot of faces that I know have been here at least once or twice before, so it's good to see you here this morning. It looks like everybody's had a piece of bagel or piece of fruit or something like that. So, and that'll be around for after the event here this morning. We're very pleased that you can join us here at the Manning Center this morning. The intent of the Manning Center is dedicated to building Canada's conservative movement, and we do that through a variety of means. We do that through teaching, through research, through guest speakers, as we're doing this morning actually as well. And so we're very pleased that you could join us for this particular time. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning, and that is Michael Chong. Michael was first elected to Parliament in 2004. He represents the riding of Wellington-Halton Hills. As a cabinet minister, Michael served as president of the Queen's Privy Council and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. There we go. We're just going to add a technology there. And Intergovernmental Affairs and Minister for Sport. Prior to his election, Michael served as the Chief Information Officer for the National Hockey League Players Association. So any tips for hockey pools, I'm sure that he has some ideas on that one for you. He was also Senior Technology Consultant to the Greater Toronto Airport Authority and for the redevelopment of Pearson International Airport as well. Michael co-founded the Dominion Institute, which is Historica Dominion Institute as well, which has played a significant role in knowing our history, knowing our roots, what's built this country as it is right now. It's an organization committed to raising Canada's awareness around history and civics, and he currently sits on the Board of Governors. For the past several years, Michael has researched and spoken publicly on how to improve and increase democracy, specifically in the House of Commons, around the issue of restoring balance and well, I'm not going to. He's got a number of things he wants to talk about today, and I think that's actually quite exciting. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michael and ask him to take his time. So, good morning, welcome. Thank you. Yeah. I'm just going to push your button here so it turns green. You can do it from here, or you can do it from up here, and we got green lights. So, come on.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in Calgary. I've been coming to the city for 20 years. I've just really enjoyed watching the city grow over the last 20 years. You know, when I came here 20 years ago, it was much smaller, much different city than it is today, and it's grown into this real center in Canada, not just politically, but also culturally and economically, and it's just such a joy to come back to the city every time and see all the new buildings going up and all the new people that have arrived and all the new activity and all the optimism and energy that this city has. So it's really a delight to be here again. And thank you, Mr. Manning, for hosting us here today. You know, your work, it's been almost 20 years since the Reform Party made its big wave on the national scene. I think it was in October 1993. And I think your legacy is strong in Ottawa and continues to this day with the sort of dictate that all parties now accept, that we have to have balanced budgets. And your continued work with the Manning Center on democratic reform is ringing strong in Ottawa, and I think continues to attract a lot of interest. So thank you for your leadership that you've shown over the years as well. Today I wanted to talk to you about one of the big challenges I think we face in Canada. And it's a little esoteric, it's a little academic, but I think it's really important. And that is the concentration of power in political leaders' offices. And that's not just true at the federal level, I think it's true throughout our provincial legislatures as well. And this is a really important question. And the reason why it's an important question is because the great Western project of democracy has been to ensure that power is diffused throughout our political system. It started with the Magna Carta in 1215, when the nobles went to the king and said, no, you don't have absolute rights. We have rights as well, and so we're going to restrict your ability to control everything throughout the kingdom. It continued with John Locke and his development of his political ideas, with Montesquieu, who wrote the famous book, The Spirit of the Laws, who first articulated that any just system of government, any good system of government should have a balance and check on power with the division of powers between the judicial, executive, and legislative branches of government. And it laid the foundation for democracies in the New World with the ideas of John Locke and Montesquieu are written directly into the American Constitution. The ideas of John Locke and the Magna Carta form the basis of Westminster parliamentary democracies throughout the world today. So it's a fundamental principle of our democracy that power shouldn't be too concentrated in a single point in our system of government. But I think today we have a system where the power is too concentrated in a single spot, and that is in the leaders' offices. And it's not a recent phenomenon of the last 5 or 6 years. This has been something that's been going on for decades. In fact, there's been many books written about this. People like Donald Savoy at the University of Moncton. There's been a whole range of essays and research that's conducted into this. And so I think we in Canada should take a look at why this is the case and what should be done about it. If I were to summarize what I think is the problem, I think we can break down the problem, the cause for this problem in 3 ways. The first is that in October 1970, the then government of Prime Minister Trudeau implemented a change to the Elections Act that took away democracy from local electoral district associations and gave it to the leader's office. And so today, the leader of each political party, not just federally but provincially, determines who gets to run for that political party as a candidate in an election. And so, to my knowledge, we're the only Western democracy that has accorded the leaders of the political parties such power. I don't know of any other Western democracy where the political party leaders have that kind of power. And so that change has been used by successive leaders to strengthen their control and to ensure that control remains ever strong. The second reason, I think, for the disequilibrium in our system is that caucuses have changed over the last 20 years. Parliamentary party caucuses used to be decision-making groups, used to be places where decisions were made that bound the leader of the parliamentary party. That's no longer the case. They've essentially become focus groups where the views of caucus are very important, where the views of caucus are taken into account, but ultimately where the decisions are not made and where the decisions are not bound onto the leader. And I think this is a second big challenge in our system. And it comes as a result partly of the fact that we have an unwritten constitution. If you go down to the United States or to many other republics, their structure of caucus is codified. It's clear what constitutes a caucus member. It's clear what the rules for caucus expulsion are. It's clear what decisions caucus can make, how those decisions and processes are to be taken, and it's all codified into black letter ink. That's not true in Westminster systems of government, where it's largely based on convention and tradition. I think the third reason for the disequilibrium in our system is that the power of caucus to have a say in the leadership of the caucus has been severed. And so today, Canada is the only Westminster Parliament where caucus has no say on who the leader of the party can be. And you can just look at recent examples. We all know the famous example of Margaret Thatcher when she was leader of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. But there's been a much more recent example. In Australia, the Labour Party, which recently underwent an election and was replaced by the Liberal Party, their Conservative Party. The Labour Party down there went through 2 leadership changes in the space of about 2 years because caucus made the decision to change the leader, from Kevin Rudd to Julia Gillard and then back to Kevin Rudd. The point I'm trying to make here is that that reciprocity and the power structure between the leader of the party And his or her parliamentary caucus is important because it ensures that the people's representatives have a say in the decisions that get taken. These points are incredibly important in Westminster parliaments, and I want to make a fine distinction here between republics to the south of us and Westminster governments. In Westminster parliaments, power of the institution does not flow directly to elected members. As Preston will know, power flows through the parliamentary parties. That's very different than Republican systems of government like the United States and like France, where power flows directly to the elected representative. So a person like Senator Joe Lieberman can step outside of his Democrat caucus and still retain a lot of the rights and privileges and power that he had because a lot of it's based on the seniority of the member rather than on their political parliamentary party affiliation. But in Westminster parliaments, all the power of the institution flows through the political parliamentary party to the member. So if you step outside a parliamentary party, either voluntarily, like some members have done, or involuntary because you're expulsed, or because you don't meet the quota of 12 members, like Elizabeth May, you have virtually little ability to affect outcomes. You can't sit on committee. It's very difficult for you to, it's impossible for you, frankly, to introduce a bill into the House unless your name has been selected in the random lottery. It's difficult to introduce amendments to bills. It's difficult to participate in debates. So it's very difficult to be an effective member. And that is just the nature of our Westminster parliaments, not just here in Canada, but elsewhere. So the point is, who controls these parliamentary parties becomes vitally important. And in the last 30, 40 years, the pendulum has swung from a situation where individual members of parliament have controlled the parliamentary party to a situation now where once the party leader is elected, they control everything. And I think these three challenges that we face need to be addressed. They need to be addressed because in the long run, Canada is best served by a system of government where power is diffused throughout Parliament, where more discussion, more debate is had, more of a clash of ideas are held. And I think in the long run, that results in much, much better decision making. I'll finish by leaving you with this thought about those who may like the idea of centralized systems of government. Centralized systems of decision-making are highly effective in the short run. They are very efficient ways to come about to decisions, very efficient ways to govern a country. But in the long run, they lead to bad outcomes because every so often, as has been said, a bad emperor comes along and makes terrible decisions that undo all the good work of the previous leadership. And as Winston Churchill once said, and I'll paraphrase, you know, democracy is a terrible form of government. It's inefficient, it's messy, it's slow, it's infuriatingly complex, it's full of compromise. But it's the best system we've ever figured out. And so in Canada, I think the same applies. And in the interests of this country's future, I think we need to restore the balance between the political party leaders and the caucuses in Ottawa and throughout the provinces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to have an opportunity for questions in just a few minutes, but before that, I'd like to invite Preston Manning up to bring his comments as well, and then Michael and Preston are going to have a conversation, and then we'll get a chance to join into that conversation as well. Preston probably needs no introduction and is in the building and carries his name on the front mantle. He's familiar to likely all of us. He formed two political parties, was leader of the official opposition, and since Parliament has almost had a bigger impact in democracy across this country, he's a passionate writer, a commentator, and is in the media on a regular basis with ideas and bringing those ideas to fruition as well. One of his chief concerns has been the growth and stabilization and expansion of democracy here in Canada, and that's something that we hear about and talk about here regularly at the Manning Centre. And so, Preston, I'd like to invite you to take the podium, and we'll hear from you as well. So.
That's working. I think that's working. Yeah, well, thank you, David. And Michael, we just really want to thank you for joining us this morning. And congratulate you on your efforts to promote stronger democratic processes in the Parliament. I know that's been a hard role for you, but a lot of respect for your efforts. I want to wish you all the best in the future. You should know that actually the procedure here, Dave, you should have told Michael, you're on camera. There's 3 television cameras here, and really the purpose of these gatherings is to get a few friends together that can ask some intelligent questions to pull things out of you, but almost the primary purpose is to get some of your remarks on video, so that in the future we have constantly people coming through here who think they want to sit in a elected assembly somewhere, and with your permission we want to take your remarks and just multiply them numerous times. And particularly those of you that in the audience, if you keep that in your mind too, to pull stuff out of Michael while we got him here that you think not only that would be of interest to you, but that you think would be of benefit to others if they were to hear it. Now, I'll just make a couple of remarks. There's 2 ways of going at trying to strengthen the democratic character of our system. And Michael exemplifies one of them, and it's actually the area that I've spent more of my time on. That is to try to change the institutions themselves, to make them more democratic. The whole crusade on Senate reform, an endless subject. I mean, that's an institution that can at least be democratized. I should mention that there's going to be a session at the Calgary School, a joint venture between us and the Calgary School, Jack Mintz's operation, on October 31st. It's actually the first day of the Conservative Convention in town here. Well, there'll be a whole day on Senate reform, Senate abolition, those arguments. But these are all proposals to change the institution. And what Michael's talked about and what we used to talk about in the Parliament about with freer votes and all the measures that you've mentioned, these are attempts to change the institution, to make it more democratic. And that has to continue, I think, and hopefully enjoy more success. Another way to come at it, though, is to try to change the people that are in the system themselves, to create more Democrats, genuine Democrats within the various parties. We're particularly interested in creating more Democrats within the Conservative movement, but you could argue this with all of the parties. If there were more genuine Democrats that were held democratic values that would support these kind of institutional change, it would be better. And a lot of our training here is more focused on trying to strengthen the knowledge, the skills, the ethical foundations, the communications and leadership capacities of people that will run for office or those that surround them, and to infuse them with that democratic spirit that might inspire more support for these types of reforms. So the only thing I'll mention in that regard is just so you get into the question then, okay, what attributes, what values do you need to have to be a Democrat, and a small d Democrat? And I'll just mention 3 of them because they are ones we're trying to infuse in people through our contacts here. The first one is that you better believe in people. I mean, this is fairly basic. You know, if you don't have faith in ordinary folks, you're not going to be a very enthusiastic democratic representative. If you're suspicious of people, if you think, well, if you let them have any say, they're going to screw it up, and there's all the kooks out there. If that's your attitude, you're not going to be a Democrat. And I think this is a very basic thing, that you have to believe that particularly ordinary folk who are consumed with a whole bunch of other concerns. They're trying to make a living, they're paying a mortgage, they've got kids, they're worried about their health and retirement. But you've got to believe that those people, given the right information and given enough time and enough opportunity, can make some fairly good decisions about who ought to represent them and which direction your society should go. And if you don't have that faith, you can have all the institutional changes in the world, but the people in it don't have the faith in the public, and they will act to constrain their exercise of their democratic freedoms rather than extend them. A great quote on this, and I know some of you hear me quote this ad nauseum, but Thomas Jefferson, towards the end of his life, it's in his correspondence, asked him if you were writing another constitution. Of course, he wrote a lot of the American Constitution. He wrote the Constitution of the University of Virginia. He was more proud of that than he was the American Constitution. But someone asked, if you're writing another constitution, where would you vest the ultimate powers of society? And he had this quote that I can think of no safer depository for the ultimate powers of society than in the people themselves. And anticipating the question, and if you think them not fit to exercise self-government with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is to inform their discretion, not to take self-government from them. And that's a pretty good summary of a guy that had been through the mill democratically but still had that kind of faith in the ordinary people. The second one I'd mention is a characteristic of a Democrat should be self-control. If you've got freedom of speech but you abuse it, you'll discredit freedom of speech. If you believe in freedom of association, which is essential to democratic procedures, but you abuse it. If you form majorities, which is what democratic politics is about, you're trying to create majority to get yourself elected. You don't get things through a Westminster system unless you get a majority, so you create majorities. But if you abuse those freedoms, if you use majorities to suppress minorities, if you use your freedom of speech to go over the top, you end up discrediting the basic freedoms that democracy rests on. So there's a necessity for a Democrat particularly to exercise some self-control. And that's something that can be taught. John Milton's definition of a statesman was that someone who first learned the government of themselves and thereby became qualified to govern others. He was thinking of Cromwell, actually, who you may or may not think of as a Democrat. but he said he first learned the government of himself, and over himself gained many signal victories, so that when the time came to take the field to the external enemy, he was already a veteran in arms, skilled in the toils and exigencies of conflicts. And the conflicts that he'd resolved were not the conflicts in society originally, but conflicts within himself, how to constrain yourself. And then the third one I'd mention is actually inscribed on the outside of this room, which comes from Cicero, and that is, if you're going to get into the democratic arena, and it is more true today than if it was true in Cicero's day, enter prepared. That's what the Latin on the outside of this room is, entrate parati, enter prepared. And Cicero observed, it's in his diaries, that the younger people, particularly in his day, the ambitious young politicians, were panting to get into the forum. That was the great Roman arena. And Cicero, although he was more ambitious than most of them, took 10 years to prepare himself to get into the forum. Studied law, studied rhetoric, studied oratory, studied the history of the Roman Republic, so that he arrived there prepared. And that could not be more true than today, where with the instant communications, a young political person makes one mistake and it's on YouTube and 100,000 people know of it by 6 o'clock, enter prepared. So just to summarize then, two ways to come at strengthening democracy. One, and I think this needs constant attention, is to democratic reforms to the institutions, the Senate, the House of Commons, the legislatures, the electoral procedures. There's a lot of room for there. And then secondly, strengthening the people that are actually participating to ensure that they're Democrats. And three values that would enhance that are these ones that I've mentioned. You better have faith in people, you better have self-control, and you better arrive prepared rather than unprepared. Okay, so that's my 2 bits worth. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Preston. We're privileged when we work around here to have those kinds of conversations and hear from Preston on a regular basis, and it's always a privilege. I'm going to let the two of you have a conversation now. We've heard about individuals and personalities. We've heard about somewhat the institutional side, and perhaps I'll throw a question out that perhaps you could work around a little bit, and that's just simply around what steps could we take at this point? I know you've written about this, Michael. You've made some issues around question period and some changes to that and so on. How can we incorporate those types of changes to what would be some practical steps that we could do within our House of Commons, almost regardless of which party is in power? What steps can we take to increase that level of democracy in the House of Commons? We'll let you have that conversation and other questions as well for a few minutes here now.
Yeah, we'll let you have first crack at that. You're there.
Well, I think we need to restore, I should use the word restore, the role of the individual member of Parliament on the floor of the House of Commons. the role of the individual member has declined in the last 10, 20 years. Just two little examples. It used to be that members of Parliament could ask a question of the government without having to get approval to be on a party whip or party House Leader list, and that is no longer the case. We had a bit of a debate about that in the spring. The Speaker actually reaffirmed the right of individual members to ask questions of the government, but still the government and opposition parties control who gets to ask and answer the questions. That's not true in it's not true in London, it's not true in Canberra, it's not true in New Zealand. So I think that's one thing we need to continue to work on. I think the other thing is that more broadly speaking, we need to restore the balance between caucuses and the party leaders. We have an unwritten constitution, and that has been wonderful over the centuries in giving us the flexibility to evolve our institutions to deal with ever-changing realities. However, in Canada, I think it's also given the political elite of this country the latitude to erode the power of the legislature in favor of the executive branch steadily and stealthily without a lot of awareness, because these are conventions, they're unwritten. And even academics who study Parliament don't fully understand and know all of the ins and outs of parliamentary procedure and structure. In fact, probably only people, there's only a small group of people in this country who actually understand how Parliament works, and it's people like Preston who've been there. But outside of those walls, as some people call it, the Vatican on the Rideau, it's a pretty opaque institution in many respects as to how it operates. So I think, to answer your question in a different way, in addition to reforms like question period reform, I think we need to codify into writing the governance and structure of parliamentary party caucuses in order to formalize the relationship between the individual member of Parliament and his or her parliamentary party leadership.
Yeah, they say that you don't want to know how sausages are made, and that actually applies to laws, too. You really don't want to know how some laws are made by... I guess just one comment maybe on something that you mentioned. You mentioned our Election Act gives the leader of the party the final say on approving nominations. Unless the leader signs off that you're the nominated candidate for that party, for that riding, you can't... run. Reform tried to modify that in a small way that might have been a step in the right direction. Of course, the concern of the leadership in the party is in how do you stop some kook from getting your nomination in some riding and discrediting everything, which is the other side, and it's a legitimate concern, and particularly with new parties. A bright light attracts a few bugs, and that can be a problem for you. But what Reform did was one of our big conventions passed a motion that the leader could not exercise that right, despite the fact it was given by the Elections Act arbitrarily. And if he was going to wanted to restrict a nomination, it had to be approved by the party council. In other words, it broadened it out so the leader couldn't unilaterally stop a nomination. There was another group that would take a look at it. And that was done through a motion passed by a party constricting its own leader. It didn't change the Elections Act, but it had that effect. So I couldn't arbitrarily prevent a nomination. If I thought, look, this is going to be a problem, I had to go to the party council, and so 24 people got in a decision, which is maybe a step in that direction. But I wonder, Michael, if you might tell folks exactly what you were proposing with respect to the question period changes and how that, where that stands, whether there's still people that are interested in those types of changes. I think, as you know, the most frequent image of the Canadian Parliament on television is that full question period, which discredits the process. The most frequent image of the American Congress is a congressional hearing I mean, the American Congress has some seamy side to it, but they don't show it every night on television. They show the congressional hearing where there's, the senators or representatives are sitting on a raised dais, kind of like judges, and there's some brilliant witness being interviewed. But we show that question period. And Michael had a major motion with respect to reform of question periods. So maybe tell us a little bit about that and maybe where those ideas stand.
Sure. So the heart of the proposal was to restore the right of individual members of Parliament to stand in their place and ask a question of the government on behalf of their constituents. Today, during the 45-minute period that is question period, the Speaker generally only recognizes members who have been submitted to the Speaker at the beginning of question period by the three party whips or party house leaders. And so at the beginning of the question period at 2:15 every day, each of the three party whips or party house leaders trot up to the Speaker or by page give him a list of members who are to be recognized. And so the proposal was was a compromise proposal. I acknowledge that the party leaders wanted that control still. So the proposal was to retain that system for the first half of question period and then to establish a new system for the second half of question period, where a system would be devised on the Speaker's choosing to allow individual members to ask questions. Now, I didn't specify what that system would be, but there were a number of ideas that were being discussed, one of which was a lottery system where the Speaker would draw names out of a hat at the beginning of every September and establish a rotational or a system of speakers for the year. Individual members then could trade their slots with each other if they so wished, very similar to the way private members' business is now drawn. The other idea was simply to go on a rotational schedule that the Speaker would issue at the beginning of the Parliamentary session in September. And there were a number of other ideas being floated about, but that was the heart of the proposal. The motion was adopted by the House, and it was studied at committee, but the committee did not issue a recommendation. So it stalled in committee. However, it came somewhat to a head in in the spring, when Mark Warawa was denied a chance to give his 1-minute statement in the House before the beginning of question period. And so the Speaker ended up ruling that he ultimately retained the right to decide who gets to speak in the House, not just during member statements, but also during question period. Nobody's taken the Speaker up. Well, actually, Leon Benoit, the member for Vegreville-Wainwright, actually exercised his right to ask a question of the government shortly after the Speaker's ruling, but to my knowledge, he's been the only member to have exercised that right, and no one else has risen in their spot to exercise the right to ask a question.
I think we should maybe have time for maybe get into some questions, Dave. Maybe one little story. This will probably depress you, but one tiny little reform that we got when we were there was it used to be on private members' bills. On private members' bills, you stand in your place and vote. And it used to be that they started and went up and down the front row first, which meant that they start with the government and meant that the cabinet and even the Prime Minister could give a signal to the backbenches by who stood up or who didn't stand up as to what they wanted to do with the bill. So one of our fellows had the brilliant idea, what if you started from the back instead of the front? Wouldn't that be better? And this actually, it went to the committee on House procedures and that, and of course the backbenchers. I used to make this speech about if the backbenchers only figured out there's more of them than the front benches, they would have a lot of power, but that required you to be able to count. And actually the committee endorsed this because the backbenchers liked that idea, but it was the same as. The committee, the House leader refused to report the recommendation, so it never got to. So we had an arrangement with our members that if you're ever in the House and you happen to notice, in this case we were in opposition, that there's no government members in the House, which occurs once in a while, usually around the Christmas party. Go to our duty desk in the back, and we'll have a table there with a pile of paper on top. Get the page to take the first thing that's on the top of the pile, get up and say, Mr. Speaker, I think we've got unanimous consent for, and read what's ever on the paper. Well, lo and behold, one night, by the Christmas party, there was only 2 Liberals in the House, and they both had to go to the washroom at the same time. And Jason Kenney is giving a talk on why Jason is in there the night before Christmas. And he notices there's no government members in the House. So we had the page go. They grabbed whatever was on the top, and what happened to be on the top was that, Mr. Speaker, I believe you'll find unanimous consent to report the report of the Standing Committee. I know it because the Speaker, who was a Liberal, is looking around trying to find somebody to say no, and there was nobody to say no. So we got this great parliamentary reform of reversing this, but not by making the argument that this made sense to about 90% of the members in the House, but by a stupid subterfuge. This will no doubt inspire your confidence in the capacity to implement democratic reforms. Okay, so we're going to take some questions.
So that's definitely the sausage-making routine of lawmaking, that in an absence of other people, you can push something through. So thank you very much for both of you. This has been an interesting conversation. I know that it's something that's it's been in your personal dictums as well. It's been something that's been written about, as you mentioned as well. It's something that is important. We've heard about the Senate. I mean, that's been an ongoing issue for many years, but it's sort of heightened its awareness right now as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you. We've got about a good 15 minutes or so for conversation and discussion. Well, I'm going to ask if you could do 2 things. One, we have a couple of hand mics, that way everybody can hear you. And secondly, if you keep your questions short, then we'll allow a little bit more time for Michael and Preston to answer that, and as well as let more people through the questions as well. So I see a couple here right now. So we'll Patrick up at the front, if you want to ask yours, and then over here as well.
Yeah, as we all know, when television was introduced in the House, it kind of changed the dynamic a little bit for question period. Mr. Manning, when you were there, I think you tried very hard to make the questions more substantive, and I think the issue was you found that you weren't getting media coverage because you weren't showing indignation with every single question. Is there a way to make the questions a little bit more substantive and a little bit more pertinent and relevant to people, and still have a successful political party and get coverage?
Yeah, our experience of that was not successful. We tried at the beginning to ask a substantive question, and we were trying to get a substantive answer from the minister. And we would call the minister up in advance and say, look, I'm going to ask you this. It's not loaded. My supplementary will be this. All we're looking for is a straight answer. But we couldn't get cooperation from the government. And as you say, we started being hammered. In those days, we were the third party. The Bloc was the opposition because they were going at it in the traditional way and producing all kinds of sparks and good stories for the French media. And we weren't doing the same for the English media. We were just getting hammered, so we stopped that. But I think Michael, in his proposals, had some suggestions. The British Parliament is better at this. For example, dedicating one particular day to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's questioning and particular ministers. Maybe you can say a little bit about your proposals actually were to try to get a way to get more substantive questions approved.
Yeah, one of the ideas was to get rid of the 35-second rule. So the 35-second rule, as Preston will know, came into effect, I believe, in 1997, when the Speaker decided to shorten the length of time a member had to ask and to answer a question to 35 seconds. Previously, members could ask much longer questions, a minute or so, and ministers could give longer answers. So one of the proposals was to get rid of the 35-second rule, allowing for more substantive answers. And that's currently the case in places like in the Westminster Parliament in London. I think the Reform Party had the right idea with their views on and their implementation of, I think the Reform Party had the right idea on question period in 1993. I think the challenge was that they altruistically applied it to themselves and ceded political advantage on the floor of the House to the other three political parties then in the House. And I think that was the tactical error. But I think the ideas were right, and I think if applied to all parties at the same time through rule changes, I think would actually lead to a much more effective question period.
One of the other problems, I don't know how much is just the House of Commons, but we have this idea for creating a model parliament in Canada. I've gone around and interviewed the speakers and the House officers of the 14 senior parliaments on what would you do different, or what do you see problems in the future? And one that they see is this use of technology. I think it was the Speaker of the Ontario Legislature says, well, you know, you get the opposition member gets up and reads from his BlackBerry with the guys in the back telling him, here's what the question is, here's what the supplementary is. The minister gets up and is reading from his device what his guys in the back are saying. This Speaker said, maybe we should just get the guys in the back together and forget the minister. But the technology aids this current style, and how to sort of marry that technology to a more substantive question period is another kind of technical problem.
Mr. Generous.
Okay, is this on? Okay, great. Thanks very much for your talks. Michael, I want to ask two quick questions. First of all, it seems we're talking about political institutions, but sort of in a vacuum from political culture. Right now, people vote primarily based on political parties. Does it make sense to empower the individual member before we get people thinking more about members when they vote as opposed to parties? One thing that I think would be great is to take the party labels off the ballots. People at least have to make that connection themselves. Yet the other question is, my understanding is originally the reason we have a different system in Canada in terms of leadership selection is because of regionalization. That there was a concern that if you just have the parliamentary caucus determining who the leader is, and if you only have elected members from Quebec or from the West or whatever, it's more difficult to get a national leader. Do you see ways of modifying the system as it exists in the UK or Australia to try and take those regional differences into account?
So to answer your first question, I think that, you know, if we make the individual member of Parliament, the role of the individual member of Parliament more relevant in Ottawa, I think people will pay more attention to who their local candidate is, still taking into consideration who the party leader is and which party it is. So I think we can lead if we make those changes and actually instill in people a greater sense that their local representative is actually very important. To answer your second question, I think we can't. The horse is out of the barn. We can't go back to a system where caucus exclusively decides who the leader of a party is. I think our political parties have become democratized through the leadership selection process, and I think that should remain in place. However, I think you can introduce a blended system where you give parliamentary party caucuses the right to trigger a leadership review if they so wish, and still leave the decision as to who will be the leader to the political party at large and to its membership. And that's, in fact, a hybrid system the UK Conservatives have recently put in place. The parliamentary party can trigger a leadership review. The parliamentary party caucus then can whittle down the slate of candidates. Let's say there are 8 leadership candidates. They can whittle it down to the final 2. The final 2 then are presented to the party membership at large for final decision. There are a variety of hybrid combinations you could come up with, while at the end leaving the final decision as to who will be party leader to the party membership.
One of the things that the public can do to enhance this, strengthening the interest in the individual member, is in election, when there are election meetings and forums, to ask questions about democratic representation. I've participated in hundreds of public meetings with question periods during election campaigns. The number of questions about this issue from the public about democratic representation is probably not more than 5%. So you can see how candidates get the idea that the rank and file don't care about this. Like at every democratic forum like that, somebody ought to get up and ask each candidate, if you're elected, do you represent yourself? Do you represent your party? Or do you represent me? And what do you do when there's a conflict? that question will bring out that person's concept of democratic representation and what weight they attach to the party versus their own position. But it's got to come from the public, because otherwise the candidates get the idea this is a kind of an academic discussion. The rank and file aren't concerned about representation, and something needs to change that.
Yeah. Other questions from the audience? Chong.
Just leave this right down. So thanks very much for all the work you've done in question period. I'm a former staffer, worked in Ottawa. I worked in Edmonton too, so it's a complete waste of time. It wasted 3 hours of my day. Every day there was question period. I did QP binders, I did QP questions, so I was one of those guys writing the questions.
You had a binder, yeah.
The binders. What more do you think can be done? Do you think in the next 2-3 years, do you think it's reasonable to expect any changes to question period?
It's hard to tell. My hope is that the Speaker's ruling will produce a group of members that will, at the right occasion, establish a new precedent for asking questions in the House without having to get onto the party lists. I think it's going to require a special moment in our political life. I don't know what that might be. It could be a crisis of some sort in the country. It could be some big debate that we don't know about that will emerge, that will allow a backbench member to rise in their spot and ask the question of the government and get a substantive response, and thereby set the precedent of a new way of doing question period. You know, in the spring we had a bit of a change in question period when the scandal about Senator Duffy broke. The leader of the opposition, Mr. Mulcair, actually took a very different approach to asking questions of the government, much more prosecutorial, much more pointed, very short questions, 5-second questions, trying to get the facts and the details. And it really changed the tone and tenor of the House. And the consensus amongst the National Press Gallery and many members was that it was a very effective way of asking questions. So I think if we get that special moment and members from either side of the House, based on the Speaker's ruling of the spring, take the opportunity to establish this precedent and make it part of the political culture in Ottawa, I think we could achieve that change in question period.
One of the long-term things that we hope to do is, I mentioned, we'd like to get this model parliament somewhere, a 60-seat replica of the House of Commons with everything. And it would serve two purposes. One is a training purpose for people that think they want to sit in an elected assembly, but the other would be a laboratory to experiment with these types of changes, because the real legislature and real parliament, the risk of experimentation is so high. You've got too many people in there who have a vested interest in the experiment failing, no matter what. The opposition particularly, and that's why governments won't do it. But there'd be nothing to stop this model parliament from experimenting with anything, everything, including the reforming the question period. And if the experiment doesn't work, who cares? Nobody will pay attention. But if it does work, if you could put on a real, genuine question period and you video it and then go and show the guys in the real place, look, this was better television than what you guys are doing, I think you could actually make some yards on that. But you've got to demonstrate it somewhere else where it's safe. It's so hard to get the real parliament to experiment with anything except the most modest changes.
Any other questions from the audience at this time?
May I just ask for more?
Short supplemental? Sure.
Very short. You mentioned at the very beginning in your presentation that, over the last 25 years, members have gotten weaker, caucuses have gotten weaker, and the party leader's office has gotten stronger. But members still have retained, the caucus has retained the ability to get rid of the leader. I think of Ed Stelmach here in Alberta. I think of Jacques Parizeau, Bernard Landry, André Boisclair. Parti Québécois is renowned for getting rid of its leaders in like bloodbaths, like amazing bloodbaths in Quebec. So they still have this power, Stockwell Day. They still have this power to get rid of their leaders. Is there any other power you think they need to retain or need to get back that's critical in order to empower members, empower caucuses versus the leader's office?
Well, I would put to you that parliamentary party caucuses no longer have the right to review the leadership of the party. I think the precedents are fairly strong right now that power rests with the party membership, but only when the party loses an election. So I think it would be very difficult for a parliamentary party caucus to trigger a leadership review. It does happen provincially, but I think it's rare, and the overwhelming precedent is that decision now rests with the political parties and only after an election loss. I think there are other challenges, though, with parliamentary party caucuses. Many parliamentary party caucuses no longer elect the caucus chair, no longer elect the caucus leadership. Formal votes are no longer taken at caucus on decisions, and it's become much more of a focus group, an important focus group, obviously, a place where every week the leader gets to, and the parliamentary leadership get to receive the views of Canadians through their elected representatives, but no longer a decision-making body that binds the leadership. And I think to solve that problem, we need to do away with that unwritten part of our Constitution. We need to codify into black letter ink the structure and rules that govern these parliamentary party caucuses. They are too vitally important to the functioning of our Parliament, to the functioning of our House of Commons, to allow them to continue to be run in such an opaque and undemocratic fashion. And I think the public trust has been abused over the last 30 years, and I think it needs to be restored, and it can be only restored through the codification of the structure and rules governing these caucuses.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I have one closing question, and this could be a short answer, actually. We know that the House of Commons is actually being physically renovated over the next several years. The format up till now has been that it's the benches are 2.5 sword lengths apart, which naturally sets up an adversarial type process. We've talked a little bit about question period. We referred to decorum within the House of Commons. Is there a physical structure change that should be considered that would change the format of the actual debate within the House of Commons as well?
Well, I'd be very much in favor of getting rid of the desks. And the reason for this is simple. You get rid of the desks, you get rid of that protective sort of charging ram that everybody has in front of them. And you also get rid of the ability to have all these accoutrements on your desk, like laptops and Blackberries and speeches and everything else, and you force members to stand in their place and to speak directly to the member opposite, as opposed to the system we have now where members are very scripted. You know, that speaks to the second point, which is that, you know, one of the other erosions in our parliamentary democracy was that the rule, which has now been abandoned, to speak extemporaneously, in other words, to speak without notes, is now gone. It used to be the case that you actually had to rise in your place and speak with your own ideas and with your own thoughts. You could rely on notes, but you weren't to read your speech into the record. Well, that rule has been completely abandoned, and members more often than not now speak directly from the speeches that have been written, often by staffers in Ottawa. And that rule about speaking from your own thoughts and ideas has now been abandoned.
Right.
When I was doing my survey of speakers and House officers, I asked this question, the one of benches versus desks, because you know Westminster, they don't have the desks, they got benches. The majority thought you couldn't change it much, so the majority sort of grudgingly were in favor of desks. But there is, I think, one state assembly in Australia that has both. This is a Canadian answer. Apparently, they have desks that can be, or they have benches with a thing that folds out, so that you can actually you can have a debate when there's only benches. But then if it's second reading or something where there's you might want a lot of paper, you can have a desk. So maybe the Canadian solution would be to do both.
A great Canadian compromise. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you both for your insights, for your taking your time this morning, for your work in the past, both in the last 20, 30 years and in the last several years as well, of trying to bring and enhance and encourage democracy back into the House of Commons, and which by nature extends across the country as well. It's how we view our democratic institutions. When we only see negative things on the top of the newspaper or the top of the television news hour, we get a negative feeling about democracy and how our parliamentarians are actually working. So the offer of positive ideas and encouragement is an opportunity that should not be missed at this particular time. So thank you both for your taking time. Let's just give a thanks.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Just a couple of closing words for you. As Preston mentioned today, we have a number of different events coming up. If you're a fan of Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, next Wednesday night is actually movie night. We have a movie night. Opportunity for us to view some entertainment, but also from a political standpoint of what are the issues that they're actually talking about, or how are they doing something in this particular movie. We've had a chance to have some fun around that as well. So next Wednesday night will be a couple of clips from Yes Minister. Ian Brodie, the former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister Harper, will be our host that evening, and maybe we can pick his brain just a little bit about how close Yes Minister is to what actually goes on in the Prime Minister's office and beyond.
What we're going to ask Ian is if you're the Chief of Staff the Prime Minister and the Deputy Minister has absolutely captured Minister X, what do you do? So it will be entertaining.
A couple of other things that are coming up over the next couple of weeks. We have a series of different campaign-related workshops that please go onto our website, manningcentre.ca, to look at those and to register for them as well. I would also encourage you to look towards the end of October. All the details haven't been completed yet, but we'll be doing what we're calling a talk and tour around the same time that the Conservative Party convention is here in Calgary, and we have 2 days of mini lectures and tours of the building, and a series of different people bringing lectures as well. And as Preston mentioned already this morning, that at that same time we'll be having a full day of reforming the Senate. We'll be bringing a series of different people in on abolishing the Senate to reforming the Senate and several different perspectives in between, and just sort of bringing that discussion to a new level a little bit of academic and political history, and where does that go for the future as well. So if you're interested in those things, please go to our website. If you're not registered for our mailing list, please do that. You could actually do that today before you leave, and we'd love to keep you up to date with what events are coming up in the coming weeks and months as well. Thank you very much for coming out this morning. We'll get you out on time and let you go for the rest of your day. Thank you so much for coming today.